From the Toronto Star, I'm Adrian Chung, and this matters. It doesn't sound like much, but it is decades in the making. A teal-green statue of a man with a rope tied around it comes crashing down with a hollow thud. Indigenous activists, students, and allies tore down the statue of Egerton Ryerson at his namesake university in Toronto in early June. Ryerson as a school goes back 75 years, but Ryerson the person and the pain he caused goes back much further. Egerton Ryerson is considered one of the chief architects of Canada's residential school system, the very system that perpetuated a cultural and literal genocide of Indigenous people. There have been calls for years to change Ryerson University's name, none louder than after the recent discovery of 215 Indigenous children in unmarked graves at a residential school in BC. Now, hundreds of students and faculty members are publicly disowning the name of Ryerson University. Instead, they're calling the institution they work and study at X University, and they say they won't be satisfied until the school permanently changes the name. We're joined by Hayden King, director of the First Nations-led think tank Yellowhead Institute, based at what they call X University. Hayden is Anishinaabe and an educator on Indigenous issues and policy at the school. The reckoning over Ryerson and how the fight to decolonize goes way beyond just one university campus. Hayden, thanks so much for your time and for joining us.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here, Adrian.
When you saw those images, powerful images, the videos of people pulling down the statue of Egerton Ryerson, what went through your mind?
I think there was a pretty overwhelming sense of relief and also a little bit of surprise, I guess. In some ways, I guess I was just surprised that it happened, and then I was sort of surprised at myself for being surprised because the community has been calling for this for so long, and I sort of expected this to happen a long time ago. And I guess that sort of added to my sense of, I don't know, something really significant had just happened in this community that I belong to that we'd been waiting for so long. And that the community did it, themselves, I think that really made it so much more powerful and contributed, I think, to my sense of really just relief.
What does that statue being torn down symbolize to you? Or is it more than a symbol? Is it direct action?
Yeah, I mean, it comes on the heels of many years of activism among Indigenous students at Ryerson and faculty and staff as well. And, the community, the broader Indigenous community, has often voiced their concern and displeasure with the statue. And so I think that, the community did what the university was unwilling to do. And in some ways, I think it was sort of, a pretty poor reflection on the university for failing to act sooner. But in other ways, I think about how the statue came down, and I really can't think of a more appropriate way. The community showed its power. And the fact that the university decided, we're not going to put the statue back up, we're not going to restore it, that's also a symbol. And I think that we can credit the community for really pushing so hard to make this happen.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that this has been going on for some time. Again, this is the push to rename Ryerson University. Didn't start last week. It has gone on for some time. How long has that push been happening to take the statue down, to remove the name of Ryerson University? How long have you seen this work go on for?
Well, I've been at Ryerson on and off for 7-8 years. I've had 2 tenures at Ryerson. And when I first came, I came on a contract, just teaching a few courses here and there. And when I was recruited for the position, I definitely had this hesitation, do I want to leave the university where I'm at that doesn't have this, myth about what I viewed as a colonial villain at the time, to go to this place that clearly honors and celebrates this person who's done so much harm. And so I had that hesitation 7 years ago, and the faculty that were there before me also had the hesitation. And, my understanding is that for decades, Indigenous students in the community had been trying to convince the university to make some change. But there's important context to this. I mean, Indigenous students really only started to come to post-secondary education in significant numbers really in the 1990s and 2000s. So there hasn't really been a critical mass of Indigenous students and faculty. And in fact, it's just been in the past few years where we've added more than, 5 or 6 Indigenous faculty to Ryerson University, and our student numbers are still low. There's a reason for that, I think. But the community that has been here, you got to give them credit for their bravery to speak out about this. I mean, they've suffered harm. Students talk about sitting in meetings with senior administrators and being bullied effectively. And they've done this work, and they've suffered for it. And so I hope that, all those alumni that have left, I hope that they can look back on this one victory and feel a little bit proud.
We'll be right back. Do you think the discovery in Kamloops of 215 Indigenous children at a residential school in unmarked graves, do you think that this gave the movement the push that it needed? It brought it to a forefront that, like you said, maybe 15, 20 years ago, it didn't have that same kind of backing. Do you think that this event brought it really to the forefront for people?
Yeah, there's no doubt that this really galvanized people. I think this particular campaign, and I mean the ex-university campaign, started in mid-May of this year. And it was new. It's a different way to communicate the community concerns. And I think it had gained a lot of support. But, I don't think anybody expected the discovery of the bodies of 215 Indigenous children at that Kamloops residential school. And I think and I don't want to speak collectively for everybody, but my sense in the conversations that I had, there was this overwhelming feeling of grief and sadness and shock. And then I think people wanted to translate those feelings into action and energy. And it resulted in anger and passion. And a lot of it was directed at Ryerson. And not just, in our small community or even in Toronto. I think nationally people were looking at the conversation around residential schools and reconciliation, or so-called reconciliation, and saying, it's time to stop honoring these individuals. And so, yeah, most definitely it galvanized the Indigenous community, and I think it also galvanized the non-Indigenous community. I mean, there's a letter from non-Indigenous faculty at Ryerson that has over 400 signatures to change the name of the university. There's a staff letter that has nearly the same amount, and staff, in many cases aren't protected by unions, so they're risking their jobs by signing on to that. And I think it speaks to how much, I think, finally, in some ways, a lot of the Ryerson community is listening now. And I think we can credit that to a degree to the discovery at Kamloops.
I was a student at Ryerson University, and I remember, obviously, the statue of Egerton Ryerson. It's kind of in the heart of the campus, and it sort of looms over one of the main streets on the campus. And I just wonder, what did that feel like as an educator to walk those streets every day, to see that statue? What did that mean to you?
Yeah, I mean, some days, you'd walk by it and, you'd sort of have fantasies of, it would be really easy just to tear this statue down. Or I wonder what it would take to tear this statue down. Or, I'm going to do some guerrilla art on Ryerson's head. Those are the sort of feelings I think that I remember having most vividly. And keep in mind, it's been over a year since I've been on campus. But yeah, I think that's really how I felt. Like I just had urge to remove this statue and try to, hold somebody accountable for the consequences of the system that Ryerson helped set into motion. Yeah, I guess that's really what I felt.
You mentioned students before. What kind of message do you think having the name of Ryerson, having that continue, do you think it affects Indigenous students' enrollment? Do you think it affects the way they see the university? What did you mean by that?
Well, I mean, students have told us themselves what they think. They wrote an open letter to the community, and Yellowhead Institute published their open letter, and they said exactly that. They're tired of carrying this man's name around with them. It was difficult for them to, feel good and proud about attending post-secondary education, many of them first-generation university students. And, I don't want to presume to speak on behalf of students because they have their own voice, and it's a very loud one. We've seen that over the last few weeks. But I think in my time at Ryerson, there's a subtext to our conversations about our school. And often it's not spoken. It's just a sort of latent shame, I think, that we're here and we're upholding the name of this man who, contributed to a lot of harm. And so, like I said, it's not my place to speak on behalf of students, but, based on my own conversations with them and based on letters that they've written over the years, as I said, it's a long campaign. been a long campaign. I think we can pretty accurately say that students are pretty deeply invested in a name change.
In talking about decolonizing spaces, we can see that this conversation clearly extends beyond just the university. Of course, this is a clear and present case, but I'm also thinking about last summer, during Black Lives Matter protests when Confederate statues were torn down.
Protesters aren't waiting for cities and counties and are pulling down monuments to Confederate history, setting statues on fire and dragging others out of parks and public squares.
And I wonder if you think that there's been a shift in the actions that we take towards monuments and towards statues of people who have a clear colonial and racist history. Do you think something has changed?
It's difficult to say that in the moment because for me, especially the last few years, it's really felt like we're in a period of transformation. I do think the Black Lives Matter movement really did contribute a tremendous amount of energy to the campaign to address these narratives of who Canadians and Americans think they are and, what their institutions are responsible for. And I mean, you have to think back in the Ryerson context, there was an Indigenous Black solidarity group that made really powerful demands for change a few years ago before the Black Lives Matter movement really erupted. And then during the movement last summer, it was, 3 Black community members that vandalized the statue and were charged with mischief.
These are the statues and the symbols of racism, of slavery, of anti-Blackness, of colonialism, of anti-indigeneity that they were protecting more than they were protecting us.
And so I think that there is, when it comes to the Ryerson statue, and then increasingly nationally, a real solidarity between Indigenous and Black communities to make that change. And so I think both campaigns have been happening simultaneously. And what you're seeing, especially in the Canadian context, is somewhat of a coming together, at least supporting one another. And that makes these movements so much more powerful.
Looking ahead, again, you mentioned Ryerson University's president says the statue of Egerton Ryerson will not be replaced or reinstated after it was torn down. There is also a task force at the university that is looking at the ways the university needs to change here in terms of the name, in terms of the legacy of the namesake. With that in mind, do you think that something will change now? Do you think that this is the start of something that is happening at the university, that is happening when we reckon with Canada's colonialism?
That's a tough question. I think the momentum that I see at Ryerson anyway is greater than at any time in my history with the university. I think that it's got to be really difficult for the senior administration after the last few weeks to continue to justify the Ryerson name. And I think, we're also just seeing a widespread lack of support. And that's a big deal because when the university's students, alumni, faculty, staff, honorary doctorates, board of governors, can no longer stomach being associated with the name of the university, there's really no choice. There's really no options. And the longer that the university delays making this decision, I think the worse our reputation is coming out of this. And I wish I could say that for all the sort of colonial namesake institutions and organizations, but you have to look at the examples of the removal of Laurier and many others and see that time is now.
Hayden, it's a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much for your time on this.
Yeah, good to talk to you too, Adrian.
And that is Hayden King, director of the Yellowhead Institute at X University. That's it for today. Thanks for listening. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Adrian Chung, Saba Aitazaz, and Raju Muthar. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattinen, and our director of programming is JP Fozo. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.